Somewhere on your shelf or in an app on your phone, there's probably a Bible. Maybe it's a translation you grew up with. Maybe it's one you downloaded once and barely opened. It has Genesis and Psalms and Revelation. It has the stories most people know, the flood, the commandments, the crucifixion. What it almost certainly does not have is the Book of Enoch. And that's strange, because for hundreds of years, across multiple civilizations and religious traditions, the Book of Enoch was not considered a fringe curiosity or a piece of forbidden folklore. It was read seriously, quoted directly, and treated by some communities as nothing less than inspired scripture. It shaped how ancient people understood angels, evil, judgment, and the structure of the cosmos itself. Then, for most of the world, it quietly disappeared from the official record. Except it didn't really disappear. That's the mystery. It survived in Ethiopian monasteries when the rest of the world had set it aside. It was copied by the communities that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, who left behind fragments older than most of our biblical manuscripts. It was referenced by early Christian writers who seemed completely comfortable citing it, alongside what we now call the Old Testament. And buried inside your Bible, if you look carefully enough, are echoes of it. Passages that only make full sense once you know what they were responding to, or borrowing from, or quietly assuming the reader already understood. The Book of Enoch is one of those texts that the official story forgot to erase completely, and the question of why it was left out, and how it managed to survive anyway, turns out to be a window into some of the most fascinating tensions in the history of religion, ancient cosmology, and the way human beings have always tried to explain why the world contains so much suffering and chaos. Before we go any further, it's worth separating what popular culture says about this book from what the sources actually tell us. You've probably heard the headlines. Angels came down and slept with human women. Giants walked the earth. Secret knowledge was stolen from heaven and given to humanity. And yes, those elements are in there. But the Book of Enoch is not primarily a story about giants. It's a text about cosmic order and cosmic rebellion. It's about what happens when beings with power and knowledge choose to use that power against the purposes of the divine. It's about judgment, and about the shape of time, and about where evil actually comes from. The giants are almost a side effect. The real subject is something older and harder to name. At the center of all of it stands a figure who appears in the Bible for exactly 5 verses. His name is Enoch. In Genesis, he is described as a man who walked with God, which is already unusual language, the kind the text reserves for almost no one else. And then, instead of dying the way everyone else in those early genealogies does, Enoch simply is not, because God took him. That's it. No death, no burial, no explanation. Just a man who walked with God so closely that the boundary between the human world and the divine world somehow dissolved around him. That kind of ambiguity is an invitation, and ancient writers accepted it eagerly. What grew up around those 5 verses was an entire tradition. Enoch became the figure who had crossed into heaven while still alive, who had stood before God and heard the secrets of creation, who had walked among angels and been shown the structure of the universe, the movements of the stars, the chambers where the dead wait, the place where judgment would be rendered at the end of time. He became the keeper of hidden knowledge, the scribe of heaven, the one human being who had seen things no other human was supposed to see, and then came back to write them down. Is that what the original authors of Genesis intended? Almost certainly not. But that's how tradition works. The spaces left open by ancient texts fill up with meaning, and sometimes that meaning becomes more influential than the original silence ever was. What we now call the Book of Enoch is actually a collection of several distinct texts, probably written at different times across several centuries, all gathered under the name of this mysterious figure. Some sections focus on the story of the Watchers, a group of angels who descended to earth and set events in motion that would eventually require a flood to undo. Others describe Enoch's journeys through the layers of heaven. Others look forward toward judgment and the end of the present age. Together they form something like a library of ancient imagination, a record of how certain Jewish communities in the centuries before and after the birth of Jesus understood the universe and their place in it. And then, for reasons that took scholars centuries to fully understand, most of the world moved on and left the book behind. The journey we're about to take together follows that book across time, how it was written, who preserved it, who tried to set it aside, and what it tells us about the ancient minds that found it not just interesting but necessary. We'll look at what Genesis actually says about the strange beings at the edge of the flood story, and why those few cryptic lines generated so much anxiety and so much creativity. We'll spend time with the Watchers and what their story was really trying to explain. We'll follow Enoch into the architecture of the heavens, and eventually we'll arrive at the question that sits underneath all the others, which is what it means that a text this old, this influential, and this strange was preserved at all, when so much else from the ancient world simply vanished. If you're listening to this right now while you're winding down for the night, you're in good company. This is exactly the kind of story that rewards a quiet room and a slow pace. And I genuinely want to know where in the world you are and what time it is for you right now. Drop it in the comments. Last time I checked, it was people from dozens of countries all listening at completely different hours, and there's something about that I find quietly remarkable. A mystery this old still circling the globe. Let's start at the beginning, with a man named Enoch and the 5 verses that weren't quite enough to contain him. Open Genesis chapter 5 and you'll find one of the most tedious passages in the entire Bible. It is a genealogy, a list of names, ages, and deaths, stretching from Adam down through the generations toward Noah. The pattern is almost hypnotic in its repetition. A man is born. He lives a certain number of years. He fathers a son. He lives more years after that, and he dies. Over and over, Adam died, Seth died, Enosh died, Kenan died, Mahalalel died, Jared died. And then, in the middle of this rhythm of death, something breaks the pattern entirely. Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That's it. That's the entirety of what the Bible's oldest texts say about Enoch directly. 5 verses in a genealogy. Everyone around him dies. Enoch simply stops being here because God took him. That phrase, walked with God, appears almost nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible. The only other figure who receives exactly that description is Noah, and in his case the language sets him up for the most dramatic rescue story in the book. So when the text uses the same phrase for Enoch, it is marking him as extraordinary. Not just long-lived, not just righteous in the ordinary sense, but somehow intimate with the divine in a way that other human beings apparently were not. And then there's the ending. He was not, for God took him. The word the Hebrew uses for took, lakach, appears elsewhere when Elijah is carried into heaven by a whirlwind. There is a quiet suggestion here that Enoch did not die in the normal way, that the usual boundary between human life and whatever lies beyond it worked differently for him. The text doesn't explain this. It doesn't seem interested in explaining it. It simply states it and moves on. But the people who read it over the following centuries were very interested indeed. Here is something worth understanding about how ancient religious literature actually develops. A short, ambiguous passage in a foundational text is not a closed door. It is an open one. The silence around Enoch, the brevity of those 5 verses, the absence of any explanation for how or why God took him, all of that becomes an invitation for later writers and interpreters to fill in what the original left blank. And the more unusual the original passage, the more irresistible that invitation becomes. What made Enoch so productive as a figure was the combination of elements his brief mention contained. He walked with God, which suggested access. He was taken rather than dying, which suggested he had crossed into whatever lies beyond ordinary human experience. And he was placed in a genealogy stretching toward Noah, which put him in the general neighborhood of the flood, of the strange beings mentioned in Genesis 6, of a time when the world was apparently different in ways the text hints at but never quite explains. Put those elements together and you have a figure uniquely positioned to know things that ordinary humans should not know. A man who went somewhere no one else went and came back, or more precisely, never came back in the normal sense, and might therefore have brought knowledge with him that was otherwise inaccessible. If you were an ancient writer trying to give authoritative weight to ideas about the structure of heaven, or the origins of evil, or the workings of divine judgment, Enoch was the obvious vessel. He had been there. What scholars refer to as the Enochic tradition is not a claim that the patriarch Enoch himself sat down and wrote anything. The texts gathered under his name were almost certainly composed by Jewish writers over several centuries, beginning sometime around the 3rd century before the Common Era, and continuing well past that. When those writers attached their work to Enoch's name, they were doing something that was entirely conventional in the ancient world. Attaching a text to a revered figure was a way of claiming that the ideas it contained had deep roots, that they weren't novelties but recoveries of ancient wisdom. Enoch's name carried the weight of antediluvian authority. He was from before the flood. He had walked with God. Anything written in his name carried that gravity. What that tradition was actually trying to work out, across its various documents and layers and centuries, were some of the hardest questions human beings have ever faced. Where does evil come from? If the world was created by a God who is good, why do the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer? What is happening in the unseen dimensions of reality that might explain the chaos visible in the seen world? How does history end, and what does the shape of time tell us about the purposes of whoever made it? Those are not small questions. They're the kind that generate entire libraries, and in a certain sense that is exactly what happened. The name of a man who spent 5 verses in a genealogy became a container for some of the most ambitious theological imagination of the ancient world. And this creates the central tension that runs through everything we're going to explore together. On one side, 5 verses, a brief, mysterious, unexplained reference in a genealogy. On the other side, hundreds of pages of text, read across centuries, quoted by serious religious thinkers, preserved at tremendous effort by communities who believed it mattered enormously. The gap between those two things, between the sliver of canonical mention and the enormous weight of what grew from it, is not a problem to be explained away. It's a clue. It tells you something true about how human beings have always reached toward the edges of what the official story permits, and kept reaching even when the official story pushed back. Enoch barely exists in the Bible, and somehow that was more than enough. So when we talk about the Book of Enoch, we're not actually talking about a single, seamless book written at one time by one author. What scholars usually mean is something a bit more precise. First Enoch, or one Enoch. And one Enoch is more like a small library that has been bound between one set of covers. It's a collection of different writings, composed at different times, by different hands, in different moods, all speaking in the borrowed voice of the same ancient patriarch. If you open one Enoch in translation, you don't just get one continuous story. You move through distinct sections, each with its own concerns and its own texture. The first and most famous part is called the Book of the Watchers. This is where the story that people vaguely associate with Enoch actually lives. Here you find the sons of God of Genesis 6 given names, motives, and backstories. These are the Watchers, angelic beings assigned to watch over the earth, who instead descend, take human women, teach forbidden arts, and father giants. In this section, Enoch becomes a sort of heavenly envoy. He is taken up, shown the cosmic consequences of what the Watchers have done, and sent back as a scribe of judgment, announcing their doom and the eventual cleansing of a world soaked in their violence. Then, several chapters later, the tone shifts. You enter what is traditionally called the Book of Parables, or the Similitudes of Enoch. Here the focus turns from the distant mythic past to the looming future. The text presents a series of visionary scenes filled with thrones, rivers of fire, and a mysterious figure called the Son of Man, or Chosen One, who sits beside the Ancient of Days and executes judgment. The giants and the Watchers are still there in the background, but now the emphasis is on cosmic justice, vindication of the righteous, and the unveiling of a heavenly court that will eventually set everything right. If the Book of the Watchers explains how the world got to be so twisted, the parables lean forward and ask what God plans to do about it. After that, without any apology, 1 Enoch turns into something that reads more like a cosmic field manual. This is the astronomical book, sometimes called the Book of the Heavenly Luminaries. In it, Enoch is guided by an angel who shows him the courses of the sun and the moon, the gates in the horizon through which they rise and set, the mechanisms of the calendar, and the orderly paths of the stars. To a modern reader, this can feel like a strange detour into ancient science, but within the world of the text it has a sharp moral edge. Knowing the true calendar and the correct ordering of times is part of faithfulness. Keeping the wrong calendar, feasting and fasting on the wrong days, is a symptom of disorder. So Enoch is not just being shown a pretty sky. He's being taught how the architecture of creation reflects the will of its maker. The next major block is usually called the Book of Dream Visions. Here the writing changes again, this time into an almost surreal bestiary of symbols. Enoch recounts elaborate dreams in which humans appear as animals, sheep, bulls, birds, while angels and nations show up as other creatures. In these dream parables, Israel's history from Adam to the anticipated end is retold in coded form. You're meant to recognize the Exodus, foreign empires, the desecration of the temple, and the hope for a final restoration, all playing out in the movements of herds and flocks. It is history turned into visionary allegory, a way of seeing human events against a larger hidden backdrop. Finally, the collection closes with what is often called the Epistle of Enoch. This last portion reads less like a vision and more like a set of sermons or pastoral letters delivered from another world. Enoch addresses the righteous and chosen of later generations. He warns them about sinners and oppressive rulers, urges them to hold fast under persecution, promises that hidden wrongs will be exposed and judged, and blesses those who keep wisdom in a corrupt age. The apocalyptic scenery is still present, but the tone is more direct, more exhortational. It is Enoch the preacher, not just Enoch the visionary tour guide. Taken together, these parts do not form a simple linear narrative. They overlap in themes, they circle back to the same questions with different imagery, and they occasionally disagree in detail. That is one of the first clues that 1 Enoch is layered. Most scholars think the Book of the Watchers is the oldest core, probably from the 3rd century BCE. The astronomical book may be roughly contemporary or slightly later. The dream visions and the epistle likely belong to the 2nd century BCE, in the thick of the political and religious turmoil around the Maccabean period. The parables are often dated even later, perhaps 1st century BCE or 1st century CE, though their exact dating is contested. How do scholars reach those conclusions? Not by guessing, and not by mystical intuition. They look at language, at the kinds of Hebrew and Aramaic used in the Dead Sea Scroll fragments, at Greek loanwords in later translations. They compare the concerns of each section with what we know about different phases of Second Temple Jewish history. When a text seems obsessed with foreign kings corrupting the priesthood, or with conflicts over the temple calendar, or with righteous sufferers awaiting vindication, that helps place it against known historical crises. They also compare Enochic ideas with other Jewish writings from the same general period, books like Daniel, Jubilees, or the sectarian scrolls from Qumran, and trace lines of influence and debate. All of this makes sense once you remember what kind of literature 1 Enoch actually is. It belongs to the broad family that scholars call apocalyptic. That doesn't just mean about the end of the world, though that is part of it. It means a mode of writing in which hidden realities are unveiled through visions, angelic tours, symbolic dreams, and revelations of heavenly books. In apocalyptic literature, ordinary history is not the whole story. Behind kings and wars and famines are spiritual powers, cosmic courts, sealed decrees that will someday be opened. Geography is expanded beyond the familiar map. Heaven has levels. The earth has secret chambers where spirits are kept. There are gates in the sky and storehouses for winds and hail. Time itself is structured into fixed periods that move inexorably toward a divinely set climax. At the same time, 1 Enoch is not pure spectacle. Embedded in the visions are clear moral exhortations. The watchers are condemned not only for crossing a boundary between heaven and earth, but for teaching forbidden knowledge, weapon-making, sorcery, seductive adornment that leads humans into violence and exploitation. Wicked rulers are rebuked for injustice. The righteous poor are promised that their suffering is seen. The message is not just this is how the cosmos works, but given that this is how the cosmos works, here is how you should live. Another piece of the puzzle is the way all of this is delivered. None of the Enochic authors signs their own name. Instead, they write as if Enoch himself is speaking. This practice is called pseudepigraphy, writing under the name of someone else, usually a revered figure from the distant past. To a modern reader used to strict ideas about authorship, that can sound like simple forgery. But in the world of Second Temple Judaism, pseudepigraphy was recognized literary strategy. Writing as Enoch was not necessarily an attempt to trick readers into thinking the patriarch had literally penned these lines with his own hand. It was a way of saying, these visions belong in the age and perspective of that primordial seer, the one who crossed the boundary between heaven and earth. What we are offering here is not a new religion. It is a recovery of ancient hidden wisdom that has become urgent again. That is what makes 1 Enoch so revealing. It is not a stray curiosity sitting on the edge of Jewish tradition. It is situated right in the middle of the ferment of Second Temple Judaism, sharing language, concerns, and images with books that did become part of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Old Testament, while also pushing some of those themes further than the later canon would allow. Once you see what 1 Enoch actually is, a layered apocalyptic anthology shaped over generations by communities wrestling with oppression, evil, and divine justice, the next question becomes obvious. How does it talk about the moment when, according to Genesis, the sons of God came down and everything began to go wrong? If you go back to the Bible and look for the origin point of all this, you don't find a full story. You find a fragment. It's in Genesis 6, right on the eve of the flood narrative, and it's surprisingly brief. Now when human beings began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. That's basically it. A few lines. No names, no clear motives, no detailed consequences beyond a general sense that human wickedness has reached some kind of breaking point. And the next thing that happens is the flood. For many later readers, those verses became a kind of textual fault line. You feel the ground shift under your feet. Who exactly are these sons of God? What does it mean that they took women whomever they chose? Who or what are the Nephilim? Are they giants, heroes, tyrants, something else entirely? The Hebrew itself doesn't settle it. Sons of God can be read as divine beings, members of a heavenly council. Elsewhere in older biblical poetry, similar phrases seem to refer to angelic or semi-divine figures, but in later traditions the same wording could be softened, turned into something more human, more manageable. Over time, three main interpretations crystallized, each with its own stakes. One line of interpretation, probably the oldest in spirit, takes the phrase pretty much at face value. The sons of God are heavenly beings. Not metaphorical, not just pious people, but real entities from the divine realm. In this reading, Genesis 6 is hinting at a transgressive crossing of boundaries. Beings who belong in the upper regions descend, desire human women, and produce offspring who are not quite ordinary. The Nephilim become hybrid figures, part of a story about cosmic disorder leaking into human history. That reading raises obvious questions. If these are angelic beings, how can they take wives? How can they father children? And what does that say about the nature of the heavenly realm? Those questions are exactly the ones later writers like the authors of 1 Enoch step in to answer. A second interpretation, popular in many later Jewish and Christian circles, takes a different path. Here the sons of God are not angels. They're human rulers, powerful men who see themselves as divine or semi-divine. They claim the right to take women as they please, ignoring ordinary constraints. The Nephilim in this view are mighty warriors, perhaps legendary kings and champions, the men of renown produced by an aristocracy that treats women as property. This turns Genesis 6 into a critique of oppressive kingship and sexual exploitation. The problem is not angelic biology. The problem is human power unrestrained by justice, strong men who act like gods. When you read it this way, the flood looks like a judgment on corrupt elites and violent empires. A third interpretation, especially common among some church fathers and later Christian commentators, tries to keep everything firmly on the human level, but in a more theological register. Here the sons of God are identified with the line of Seth, the supposedly faithful descendants of Adam's righteous son. The daughters of humans are linked to the line of Cain, associated with rebellion and violence. In this version, Genesis 6 tells the story of intermarriage between the godly and the ungodly, the blurring of a moral boundary that ultimately drags the righteous line down into corruption. On this reading, the Nephilim are not supernatural hybrids. They are powerful but wicked humans who emerge when the distinction between the faithful and the faithless collapses. Each of these interpretations solves one problem and creates others. If you say they're angels, you now have to explain how spiritual beings take wives and have children. If you say they're human rulers, you have to account for why the text uses language elsewhere associated with the divine council and why the result seems so catastrophic. If you say they're Sethites and Cainites, you smooth out the supernatural edge, but you have to admit that Genesis never actually says Seth or Cain here, and that you're importing a whole framework that the passage itself only vaguely supports. The ambiguity is not an accident. Genesis gives you just enough to suggest a very strange situation, and then moves on. It doesn't pause to explain the mechanics. It doesn't catalogue the names of the Nephilim or describe their deeds in detail. It gestures, and then the flood sweeps everything away. That textual restraint is one of the main reasons the passage attracted so much later expansion. When communities live with a sacred text that hints at something enormous and troubling, but never spells it out, it creates a kind of interpretive pressure. You can feel the questions piling up in the silence between the lines. What exactly was so bad that it justified wiping almost everything out? How did ordinary humans get entangled in a catastrophe that seems to begin in heaven? Why does evil feel bigger than individual choices, like there is some structural, cosmic dimension to it? Genesis 6 doesn't offer a full theodicy. It gives a snapshot, a compressed scene at the edge of a much larger story. That is precisely the kind of gap that apocalyptic imagination loves to enter. This is where 1 Enoch becomes especially important. The Book of the Watchers, the oldest core of 1 Enoch, reads as if someone has taken those few lines from Genesis 6 and unfolded them into a complete narrative. The sons of God are given an identity. They are watchers, a class of angelic beings set to observe and protect the earth from a distance. The vague taking of wives becomes a formal descent. The watchers choose a mountain. They make a pact. They know what they're about to do is forbidden, and they bind themselves together in an oath not to back out. The Genesis mention of Nephilim and mighty men of old becomes, in 1 Enoch, a generation of giants born from these unions, whose enormous appetites drive them to consume not just human food, but eventually human beings. Violence spreads, not as a series of isolated crimes, but as the logical outcome of a world where beings with immense strength and illicit knowledge exploit everything around them. The fleeting reference to wickedness before the flood is now traced back to specific teachings. In Genesis, we hear that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. In 1 Enoch, that evil has sources. Some of the Watchers teach humans how to fashion weapons, how to make cosmetics that inflame desire, how to practice sorcery and divination, how to manipulate the created order for domination and profit. Where Genesis is sparse, 1 Enoch is lavish. Where Genesis is reticent, 1 Enoch is explicit. But it is not simply inventing a new mythology out of thin air. It is reading the same ambiguous verses and asking, in the style of apocalyptic literature, what must be true in the hidden realm for the visible world to look the way it does. Compare the two texts side by side and you can see the lines of dependence and divergence. In Genesis, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful. In 1 Enoch, the Watchers saw and desired and said to one another, "Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men." The core idea is the same. Heavenly beings see, desire, cross a boundary. But the apocalyptic version slows the moment down, adds dialogue, reveals motive. In Genesis, the Nephilim are just on the earth in those days, and also afterward. In 1 Enoch, the giants have names, sins, and a fate. Their spirits linger as restless, malevolent forces even after their bodies are destroyed, explaining the persistence of demonic evil in a world supposedly cleansed by the flood. By doing this, 1 Enoch is not trying to replace Genesis. It is performing a kind of serious, imaginative commentary. It is asking what the brief biblical report implies if you let it fully play out. And that is one of the reasons 1 Enoch became so influential in the Second Temple period. For Jews living under foreign empires, grappling with corrupt priesthoods and inexplicable suffering, Genesis 6 on its own could feel like a puzzle with missing pieces. 1 Enoch offered a way to see those cryptic sons of God and Nephilim as part of a much larger pattern. A story about heavenly rebellion, human complicity, and the deep roots of structural violence. The next step in that story is the descent itself, the moment when the Watchers leave their station, step into human history, and set off a chain reaction that Enoch is later called to witness and judge. In 1 Enoch, the Watchers are not vague spiritual forces. They are a defined class of beings with a job description. They belong to the heavenly realm, part of the divine court, but their specific task is observational. They are stationed over the earth, not on it. Their role is to watch, to record, to ensure that boundaries are kept between heaven and earth, between humans and animals, between life and death. They are guardians of order, posted like sentries along the fault lines of creation. And that is what makes their story so unsettling. The disaster does not begin with obvious villains. It begins with guardians who abandon their post. In the Book of the Watchers, the descent is not an accident. It is not a momentary lapse in judgment. It unfolds like a deliberate operation. A group of these heavenly beings begin to focus their attention downward, not in the way they were assigned, but with a new kind of gaze. They see human women. They desire them. The language echoes Genesis, but the scene is expanded into a council of rebellion. At the center of that council is a figure named Semjaza. He is portrayed as the leader, the one with enough authority to propose what everyone is secretly thinking, but afraid to say out loud. Semjaza voices the plan. They will leave their station, descend, and take human wives. But he also recognizes the risk. He knows this crosses a line set by the Most High, so he insists on a pact. He is willing to move forward only if everyone binds themselves together in an oath, so that no one can later claim they were coerced. No one can defect when judgment comes. They gather on a specific mountain, Mount Hermon in later versions of the story, and there they swear their oath. The name of the mountain itself is explained as a memory of this moment, a place of the oath. Geography is rewritten as a record of a rebellion. This is one of the most important motifs in the book, sin as a conscious, collective decision. The Watchers do not slip. They do not blunder into transgression. They organize it. They ritualize it. They turn rebellion into a covenant. From a literary perspective, Semjaza functions as a narrative anchor. He gives a face and a voice to what might otherwise be an abstract explanation of evil. Historically, we have no way of verifying that a being named Semjaza ever existed or did any of the things described. The text itself is not operating in the mode of modern biography. It is using named characters to explore ideas, responsibility, leadership, complicity. Right alongside Semjaza, another figure emerges as crucial, Azazel. If Semjaza is the ringleader of the descent, Azazel is the embodiment of misused knowledge. In 1 Enoch, Azazel is singled out for teaching humans how to make weapons. Swords, knives, shields, breastplates, along with ornamentation and cosmetics. He shows people how to transform raw materials into instruments of killing and seduction. Again, we're not dealing with verifiable history. We're dealing with a symbolic map. Azazel condenses into one name a whole cluster of anxieties. About technology, about war, about luxury, about the way new skills can amplify both our capacity for beauty and our capacity for harm. In later Jewish ritual, the name Azazel appears in Leviticus as part of the Yom Kippur ceremony. The scapegoat that carries away the sins of the people is sent to Azazel in the wilderness. Many scholars think 1 Enoch is playing with that older tradition, reimagining Azazel not just as a place or a destination, but as an active agent of corruption, whose teachings have to be symbolically exiled and condemned. Taken together, Semjaza and Azazel frame the descent as a double transgression. One side is relational and bodily, crossing the boundary between heavenly beings and human women, violating the proper separation between realms. The other side is epistemic, crossing the boundary between permitted and forbidden knowledge, giving humans tools they are not prepared to handle. This is where the story starts to speak less about angels and more about us. In the Enochic imagination, the problem is not that knowledge itself is bad. The Watchers were, after all, created as beings of insight and perception. The problem is knowledge detached from wisdom and responsibility. Warfare, metallurgy, enchantments, seductive adornment. All of these are portrayed as accelerants poured onto already smouldering human desires. The descent narrative is trying to answer a question that Genesis 6 leaves hanging. Why does evil feel so entrenched, so systemic, so far beyond the sum of individual failings? The Book of the Watchers answers by stretching the story backward and upward. Evil is not reduced to human weakness. Humans are still responsible. We see that in the way they eagerly receive what the Watchers offer, but they are also entangled in a web of influence that begins above them. Violence, exploitation, and idolatry are reframed as the joint project of rebellious heavenly powers and willing human partners. This is a subtle but important shift from some later theological traditions. In many post-biblical systems, evil is traced primarily to one primal figure, Satan, the devil, whose rebellion explains everything. 1 Enoch, by contrast, gives you a more fragmented, almost bureaucratic vision of cosmic disorder. There is no single arch-villain at the start. There is a council of watchers, each contributing their own piece of forbidden knowledge: weapons, sorcery, astrology, beautification, secrets of plants and roots. The result is a world in which every sector of life has been touched: war, sexuality, medicine, economics, religion. Evil is not just temptation whispered in someone's ear. It is built into structures, technologies, and cultural practices. At the same time, the story preserves a sense of order that has been violated, not destroyed. The Watchers were appointed with a function. They had a legitimate role. Their rebellion is intelligible only because there is a prior cosmic architecture they are twisting. This is part of why the book was so compelling for communities living under foreign rule. If you are a small Judean group watching empire after empire roll through your land, the idea that there are watchers who have gone rogue and handed empires their tools of domination feels less like fantasy and more like an interpretive lens. It also helps explain the ambiguous experience of power. The same metallurgy that gives you a plough gives your overlords a sword. The same knowledge of plants that can heal can also poison. The same gift of beauty that can celebrate creation can become a means of control. In Enoch's story world, none of that is accidental. It is the fallout of that ancient oath on the mountain. And yet, even here, the line between human and suprahuman evil is not clean. The Watchers can teach, but they cannot force. Humans can refuse, but in the narrative they largely do not. The blame is shared, layered. This is one of Enoch's most enduring contributions to the imagination of evil. Sin is not only individual choice and not only cosmic conspiracy, it is a collaboration. Heaven's guardians misuse their freedom. Earth's inhabitants embrace the offer. The flood, when it finally comes, is presented not just as a judgment on wild humanity, but as a necessary response to a creation that has been compromised from multiple directions. Before the waters rise, though, the story pauses on the moment of descent itself. Heavenly beings stepping over a boundary they were supposed to honor forever, an oath binding them together in revolt, a leader who knows they cannot go back, and in the background, a human world about to be transformed by powers it barely understands. From there, 1 Enoch will move on to show the consequences: the birth of giants, the spread of violence, the cry of the earth itself rising up for justice. In Genesis, the Nephilim are mentioned almost in passing. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, the text says, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. They are described as mighty men, men of renown, and then the story moves on. No origin story, no details, just a fragment. 1 Enoch takes that fragment and turns it into a central pillar. When the Watchers descend and take wives, the children that result are not ordinary. They are described as giants, enormous, ravenous beings that quickly outgrow the world that produced them. In some manuscripts, their height is exaggerated to absurd scales, but the point is not to give you a biological report. The point is to make you feel the way their presence distorts everything around them. The text lingers on one particular trait: hunger. The giants, we're told, begin by consuming what humans normally consume: grain, flocks, resources that could in principle be replenished. Their appetite is not proportionate to the Earth's capacity. They eat and do not stop. When the food runs short, they turn to eating humans. When humans are exhausted, they turn to devouring one another. This is mythic horror, but it is also moral logic. Unchecked desire in Enoch's world does not just strain the system, it cannibalizes it. The giants become a kind of living parable of consumption that cannot recognize limits. They embody what happens when beings with power and appetite are cut loose from the boundaries meant to shape them. They are the biological outcome of the Watcher's crossing, and the social outcome of Azazel's teachings: strength and violence with no internal break. And as their violence grows, the text says something striking. The earth itself cries out. This motif echoes Genesis 4, where Abel's blood calls from the ground. In Enoch, that idea is expanded. Creation is treated almost as a witness, a victim that can testify. The land is soaked with blood. The animals are dragged into the spiral of corruption. Everything that was supposed to be ordered and fruitful is now groaning under the weight of predation. Here the giants start to function less as an oddity and more as a kind of symbolic category. On one level, the authors probably imagined physically impressive beings: warriors, tyrants, figures who towered over ordinary people in both stature and status. The ancient world, like ours, remembered conquerors and warlords as mighty men, people whose scale of impact seemed inhuman. On another level, though, the giant tradition is mythic language for chaos made flesh. A giant is what greed looks like when you give it a body. A giant is the social effect of violence when it accumulates over generations. A giant is the system that eats people to keep itself alive. Kingdoms built on conquest, economies built on exploitation, technologies that multiply power without multiplying wisdom. 1 Enoch leans into this imagery. The giants are not just big, they are ungovernable. They are the children of broken boundaries, and so they treat every boundary as something to be crossed, between species, between life and death, between what is permitted and what is not. In that sense, they are the perfect mirror of their fathers, the Watchers. What began as a heavenly rebellion now has a monstrous form on earth. This is where Enoch's version of the flood story begins to diverge sharply from the compressed account in Genesis. In Genesis 6, the narrative moves quickly. The sons of God, the daughters of men, the Nephilim, the declaration that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time, and then God's decision to wipe out all flesh. The connection between those elements is implied but not spelled out. Second Temple texts like 1 Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and later traditions refuse to leave those gaps empty. They read Genesis as an outline, almost a set of bullet points, and then fill in the cause and effect. In 1 Enoch, the chain looks like this: Watchers rebel, forbidden knowledge spreads, giants are born, their appetites produce mass violence, the earth and the righteous cry out, and heaven responds with judgment. The flood is no longer just a response to generic human wickedness. It is a targeted act meant to cleanse a world that has been structurally altered by this hybrid offspring. Some passages go even further. The spirits of the slain giants, we're told in later Enochic sections, do not simply disappear. They become wandering, malevolent presences, one ancient way of explaining why the world continues to feel haunted by violence even after the floodwaters recede. Evil, in this model, is stubborn. You can wash away the bodies, but the consequences and patterns continue in less visible forms. This layered explanation of the flood sits alongside the biblical one, not always in perfect harmony, but in conversation, where Genesis emphasizes the moral corruption of all flesh and God's grief over human evil. 1 Enoch stretches the storyline into the invisible realms. It says, in effect, that the world before the flood failed not just because humans made bad choices, but because powers above them trained and amplified those choices into something the world could not sustain. At the same time, 1 Enoch does not let humans off the hook. The giants are born because humans consented to the Watchers. The weapons of Azazel's teaching are embraced, not resisted. The result is a partnership in destruction that feels eerily familiar if you live in any age of rapid technological change and intensifying warfare. When you put these traditions side by side, the terse biblical narrative, the elaborated Enochic account, the retellings and jubilees, you see a common thread. The pre-flood world is remembered as a time when violence became systemic. In Genesis, the phrase is, "The earth was filled with violence." In Enoch, that line is given texture. You're shown how it fills up, with giants raiding, with armies armed by new metallurgy, with sorcery and enchantments twisting justice, with beauty turned into manipulation, with the poor and weak ground underneath the feet of the mighty. The giant tradition, then, is not an isolated curiosity about big bodies. It is a way of visualizing scale. How large can a problem become before ordinary remedies no longer work? How enormous can structures of exploitation grow before repair is impossible, and only radical judgment, like a flood, can reset the system? For the authors of 1 Enoch, the answer is told through the language of monsters. When sin and knowledge and power align, they create something oversized, something that no single person, no single village can restrain. That is what the giants are. They are a world historical problem given a face. This is why, in Enoch's larger message, the story of the giants is not just sensational background, it is diagnosis. The book is saying, if you want to understand why judgment comes, you have to see how deeply violence has sunk into the bones of creation. You have to recognize how rebellion in the heights becomes exploitation on the ground. You have to see how the appetites of the few become the suffering of the many. Only then does the next movement of the story make sense, when heaven finally intervenes, when Enoch is sent as a mediator, and when the same God who set the boundaries of creation announces new limits on angels, on kings, and on the secret knowledge that unleashed all of this in the first place. In 1 Enoch, the Watchers do more than break a boundary by taking human wives. They also become teachers. The text gives their teaching specific names, and that specificity matters. It does not just say they taught knowledge in the abstract. It catalogues the arts they brought. Azazel, the chief offender, is said to have taught humans how to make swords and knives, shields and breastplates. He reveals how to work the metals of the earth, how to refine and shape them into weapons. Another Watcher instructs in the art of making bracelets and ornaments, in the use of cosmetics to beautify the eyelids, in the secrets of precious stones and dyes. Others introduce enchantments and root-cutting, occult practices and magical formulas. Still others unveil the courses of the stars, the signs of the sun and moon, astrology, and the reading of omens. On the surface, it's a list of Iron Age technologies and esoteric arts. But beneath that, each category points to a deeper anxiety. Weapons are obvious. When you teach metallurgy, you're not just handing someone a tool. You're changing the scale of what violence can do. A stone club can kill a neighbor. A forged sword can lead an army. Weapons in Enoch symbolize power unbound, force multiplied beyond what bare hands can manage. Adornment is subtler. Teaching bracelets, makeup and jewelry sounds harmless, even trivial. Yet in 1 Enoch it becomes part of the indictment. Beauty is being engineered, commodified, weaponized in its own way. The authors seem to see in these arts the capacity to manipulate desire, to turn bodies into instruments of seduction and status. It is not that caring about appearance is evil in itself. It is that beauty becomes a lever by which the strong can bend others' will. Sorcery and root-cutting point toward control of hidden forces, plants that heal or poison, rituals that claim to bind spirits or curse enemies. These arts embody the temptation to bend the unseen world for personal gain, to override natural processes with secret shortcuts. Astrology, finally, is about information. To know the courses of the stars, the calendar of the heavens, is to predict seasons, plan battles, time harvests, and coronations. In an ancient setting, access to this knowledge creates hierarchy. Those who can read the sky gain authority over those who cannot. Taken together, the Watchers are not teaching random curiosities. They are delivering a package, tools for amplifying power, shaping desire, manipulating the invisible and organizing time. It is a curriculum in domination. This is where the story slips into something larger than mythic angels on a mountain. 1 Enoch is asking a question that still feels raw. When does knowledge become transgression? The text does not present all learning as dangerous. Enoch himself is portrayed as wise, as a scribe of righteousness, as someone entrusted with heavenly secrets. The problem is not that humans learn. The problem is who is teaching, what is being taught, and toward what end. In the Enochic imagination, knowledge crosses a line when it severs itself from the boundaries God has set for creation. Metallurgy is not evil by nature, but when its first lesson is how to sharpen metal into swords rather than plowshares, it becomes a catalyst for slaughter. Cosmetics are not intrinsically corrupt, yet when they are introduced in this story as part of a seduction plot by rebel angels, they become symbols of desire detached from covenant and responsibility. Sorcery and astrology occupy a particularly charged space. They look like rival systems of wisdom, a way of accessing guidance and security without going through God. To seek revelation from stars and spirits in this framework is to bypass the moral demands that come with divine instruction. You can get insight without repentance, advantage without accountability. So the ethical question in 1 Enoch is not simply, is this fact allowed? It is, what happens to the world when this kind of knowledge is placed in these kinds of hands for these kinds of purposes? The answer in the story is written in blood. The teachings of the Watchers are not neutral information. They are accelerants poured onto existing human tendencies toward greed, fear, and status-seeking. The result is not enlightenment, but giants ravaging the earth, cities arming for war, elites adorning themselves while the land cries out. Viewed this way, the Book of Enoch reads like a reflection on technology, an empire wrapped in ancient myth. Weapons technology changes the scale of empire. When a few possess cutting-edge arms, they can organize conquest. The list of swords and shields in Enoch sounds like a catalogue of early statecraft, how to create a monopoly on legitimate violence. The authors are watching, or remembering, the rise of kingdoms whose power depends on organized killing, and they place that origin not in human ingenuity but in a catastrophic angelic lesson plan. Adornment and luxury goods map onto economic exploitation. Precious stones and dyes are not found everywhere. They require trade routes, extraction, labour. To prize them is to build systems that move wealth toward the few. In Enoch, the fascination with jewels and cosmetics is not harmless decoration. It is the visible face of a deeper inequality. Sorcery and astrology, in turn, resemble ideological tools. They promise control over uncertainty, access to the favour of gods, predictable outcomes in war and politics. In a world of empires, such knowledge can legitimate power. If you can say, the stars favour my reign, or the omen justifies this campaign, you wrap violence in a cloak of inevitability. 1 Enoch critiques all of this by placing it under the label of corrupted instruction. The problem is not that instruction exists, but that it has been hijacked. This puts the book in tension, but also in dialogue, with the biblical wisdom traditions that survived into the canon. In Proverbs, wisdom is portrayed as a woman calling in the streets, inviting the simple to learn. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Skill in living, in work, in speech, is celebrated as a gift. Ecclesiastes can be skeptical about what knowledge achieves, but it still values understanding. Even Job, wrestling with suffering, is ultimately confronted with a vision of divine wisdom woven into creation. These texts assume that the world is intelligible and that humans are called to grow in discernment. They warn against arrogance and misuse, but they do not depict learning itself as a trespass. 1 Enoch narrows the focus. It looks at a specific set of teachings, how to wield force, how to manipulate appearance, how to harness occult power, how to script reality by the stars, and says, these are not just skills, these are corruptions of wisdom, because they sever knowledge from righteousness. They are revelations that cost too much. At the same time, Enoch is not anti-revelation. The very structure of the book assumes that there are secrets God intends to disclose. Enoch is taken up, shown heavenly tablets, given visions of cosmic order and future judgment. The difference is that his knowledge flows downward legitimately, authorized and framed by divine justice. The Watcher's knowledge flows downward illicitly, smuggled across a boundary for personal gratification. In this light, the category of forbidden knowledge in 1 Enoch is not about keeping humans permanently ignorant. It is about guarding the world against forms of knowing that magnify power faster than they cultivate virtue. When the book portrays heaven responding with judgment, binding the Watchers, condemning Azazel, decreeing the destruction of the giants, it is not just punishing curiosity. It is reasserting that instruction itself must be ordered. There is a right teacher, a right time, a right context for truths that change how we live. For the communities that cherished Enoch, this framework offered a way to talk about the seductions of their own age. Technological advances, imperial propaganda, esoteric practices in neighboring cultures, all could be seen as echoes of the Watcher's curriculum. The question was not whether these arts worked, but what kind of world they were building, and who paid the cost. And that cost, in Enoch's telling, is always communal. The gifts of the Watchers do not stay in private. They spill out into economies of violence, cultures of vanity, spiritual marketplaces where everything sacred is for sale. Forbidden knowledge is not forbidden because it is too abstract for humans to grasp. It is forbidden because, once unleashed, it tends to break the weak first and the earth itself last. Set alongside biblical wisdom literature, 1 Enoch becomes a kind of dark mirror. Where Proverbs imagines instruction that leads to life, Enoch imagines instruction that leads to flood. Where canonical texts invite seekers into a path where knowledge and fear of the Lord grow together, Enoch warns that there are also other paths, brilliant, glamorous, effective, that end in giants, in cries from the ground, in a world that must be reset. In that gap between two visions of instruction, the wise and the corrupted, the figure of Enoch stands as a counter-teacher. If the Watchers are the archetype of illicit revelation, he becomes the model of faithful reception, and it is from that position, as scribe and mediator, that he is taken beyond the ruined earth to see what a rightly ordered cosmos is supposed to look like. When the corrupted instruction of the Watchers reaches its peak, the story does something unexpected. Instead of keeping Enoch on the devastated earth, it sends him away from it. In 1 Enoch, the answer to chaos is not just a bigger threat or a louder command. It is a tour. Enoch is taken on a series of journeys, led by angelic guides through a universe that is anything but random. The tone shifts from the violence of giants to something almost serene, even when the images themselves are frightening. The world is burning, but Enoch is being shown why it will not burn forever. The geography of these journeys is strange on purpose. He's taken to mountains that are made of metals, one of iron, one of copper, one of silver, one of gold, one of soft metal, and one of lead, To us, it sounds like fantasy. To the ancient imagination that told this story, it is like walking through the periodic table rewritten as landscape. These metal mountains mirror the very arts that Azazel taught on earth. Down below, people are learning to pull ore from the ground and hammer it into swords and ornaments. Up here, Enoch sees that metals belong first to creation itself. They have fixed places. They are not just raw material for human ambition. They are features in a cosmic architecture that God has already measured and weighed. He's shown rivers of fire, blazing channels that seem to run not just across land, but through the very structure of heaven and earth. Sometimes these fiery streams are linked to the sun's path, sometimes to judgment, sometimes to the places where rebellious forces are eventually confined. Fire on earth, in the Watcher's world, is smelting and weapon-making and destruction. Fire in Enoch's tour becomes something else, a stable component of the cosmos, dangerous but contained, serving divine purposes. He visits the prisons of the stars and the hosts of heaven. That phrase alone is worth pausing over. In most ancient cultures, stars are divine or semi-divine. They wander, they influence, they are worshipped. In one Enoch, they can be imprisoned. Enoch is taken to a place where errant stars, heavenly bodies that didn't keep their appointed course, are bound in darkness until the day of judgment. The image is stark. Even the sky has jails. Even natural forces, when they trespass the limits set for them, are not above discipline. The symbolic geography continues. There are hollow mountains filled with blazing pillars. There are winds stored in chambers ready to be released at their times. There are boundaries for the seas, doors of frost and snow, paths for the sun and moon with carefully measured gates on the horizon. By the time Enoch's tour is complete, he has seen a universe that is not a stage for random events, but a building with rooms, thresholds, storehouses, and courts. It is architecture, not chaos. In apocalyptic literature, this kind of cosmic tour serves a specific function. It is not a travel diary. It is a guided revelation of moral order. The surface story is that Enoch is being shown how the world works. The deeper claim is that the world is already ordered toward justice, even when current events say otherwise. Hidden behind the apparent success of the Watchers and their giant offspring, there is a structure that bends eventually toward judgment and restoration. When Enoch sees stars punished for leaving their paths, it comments back on the Watchers who left their station. When he sees winds stored and released at the right times, it speaks to a God who can unleash flood and fire not arbitrarily, but according to a measured plan. When he walks through metal mountains, it quietly insists that the resources empires fight over are not theirs. They are on loan, they have owners. For communities under pressure, people who felt that the wicked prospered, that foreign powers ruled, that the world had slipped out of joint, these journeys said, no, the joints are still there. You just cannot see them yet. The moral skeleton of the universe is intact. One part of 1 Enoch leans into this question of order with almost obsessive precision. Scholars call it the astronomical book, or the Book of the Luminaries. Here, Enoch is shown the courses of the sun and moon, the lengths of days and nights, the gates in the horizon through which the luminaries rise and set, the way the year should be measured. It is dense, repetitive, almost technical. To many readers, it feels like a sudden gear shift, from mythic drama to something that looks like a priestly notebook. Beneath the long lists and cycles lies a practical concern: calendars. In the Second Temple period, Jewish groups debated how to mark sacred time. Should you follow a lunar calendar where months track the phases of the moon and years must be adjusted with extra months? Or a solar-based system of fixed 364-day years, easier to regularize for festivals and priestly duties? The astronomical book sides clearly with a solar or solar-like system. It presents a cosmos in which the heavenly bodies move with perfect regularity, establishing a calendar that is itself righteous. To keep the right calendar in this view is to align yourself with the very pattern of creation. To keep the wrong one is to be out of sync with the moral fabric of the universe. This is more than fussy timekeeping. If the priests who control the temple calendar are using what Enoch's book portrays as a corrupt system, then their sacrifices and festivals are mistimed. Their service is disordered. The authority to define holy days becomes a site of conflict, and Enoch's visions function as an appeal to a higher court. In that light, the heavenly journeys and the astronomical revelations work together. One maps space, the other maps time. Both insist that creation itself is structured toward accountability. Judgment in this framework is not a sudden intrusion into an otherwise neutral universe. It is what happens when things that have long been misaligned are brought back into conformity with their design. When Enoch sees valleys where rebellious angels will be held, he is not watching God invent a punishment on the fly. He's seeing that there has always been a place set aside for what does not belong. When he learns the true length of the year, he is not getting a random fact. He's being invited into a pattern where feasts, Sabbaths, and jubilees fall where they ought to fall, matching heavenly rhythms. For some modern scholars, these visions look like the work of priestly or scribal circles, people deeply invested in temple liturgy, festival cycles, and the legitimacy of particular calendars. They find echoes of older Babylonian astronomical traditions filtered through a distinctively Jewish lens. The careful gate-by-gate descriptions of solar movement resemble royal and priestly law from Mesopotamia, repurposed here not to glorify kings, but to underwrite covenantal faithfulness. Others see layers, perhaps older mythic materials about cosmic mountains, underworld rivers, and star gods have been stitched into a new narrative, where monotheism has tamed them. The stars lose their independence and become obedient luminaries. The mountains of the gods become features in a world spoken into being by one creator. Still others suggest that the visions reflect internal Jewish disputes about who truly guards sacred knowledge. The official temple priesthood in Jerusalem aligned with certain calendars and powers versus dissident groups, like those who would later leave us the Dead Sea Scrolls, who claim that the majority had gone astray. In that context, having Enoch, the pre-flood patriarch, the righteous scribe, receive direct instruction on cosmic architecture is a way of saying, the blueprint is ours, not theirs. However we pass the sources, the shape of the message is consistent. Against a story in which knowledge is weaponized from below, Enoch offers a counter-vision of knowledge entrusted from above. The universe he's shown is not neutral territory for angels and humans to exploit. It is a moral building, with weight-bearing beams and load-bearing walls. Mountains, stars, winds, and calendars are all parts of a structure that cannot, in the long run, be bent without consequence. Seen this way, the heavenly journeys are not an escape from history, they are a perspective on it. They reassure readers that the corrupt lessons of the Watchers are temporary intrusions, not the final word. They hint that those who seem to control the metals, the stars, and the times are in reality renters in someone else's house, and they prepare the way for what comes next, a universe where even angels are judged, where mercy has boundaries, and where the limits placed on power, human and heavenly alike, are not arbitrary rules, but reflections of the way the cosmos itself is built. When the story turns from geography to courtroom, the tone shifts again. The same universe that has storehouses for wind and prisons for stars also has a legal system. In 1 Enoch, judgment is not an abstract idea. It unfolds in hearings, petitions, written decrees. It looks deliberately like law. The pivot comes when the Watchers realize what their rebellion has set in motion. Their giant offspring are devouring the earth. Violence and bloodshed are everywhere. The humans they lusted after and instructed are crying out under the weight of war, sorcery, and oppression. In the narrative, those cries reach heaven. God does not speak first to the watchers. He speaks to the good angels and sends them down with messages of judgment and rescue. But something unexpected happens. The watchers, now terrified, ask for mediation. They cannot approach the divine throne themselves, so they look for an intercessor. They choose Enoch. This is one of the strangest and most important moves in the book. The same human who's been walking through metal mountains and star prisons is now summoned as a scribe, a go-between. The angels who once descended in power now send a frail, mortal figure upward as their legal representative. The narrative lingers on the details. The watchers beg Enoch to write a petition on their behalf. He records their words. He reads the document to them. Then he journeys to the place where the divine glory rests and presents their plea. In most ancient stories about divine beings and humans, that is where you would expect a twist toward mercy. A brave or righteous intercessor softens the god's anger. The punishment is reduced, the sentence delayed. Enoch does intercede, but the answer he receives is absolute. In a vision, he is told to send this reply back to the watchers. Their petition will not be granted. There will be no forgiveness, no return to heaven, no reduction of sentence. Their fate is sealed. They will see the destruction of their sons. They themselves will be bound in the earth until the final judgment. The scene is chilling, but it is not just meant to frighten. It is making a claim about boundaries. Earlier, Enoch saw that even stars have limits, that even winds follow assigned courses. Now he learns that moral boundaries in this universe are just as real. Some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. The watchers have committed 3 interconnected transgressions. They have violated the boundary between heaven and earth by descending in a way they were not sent. They have violated the boundary of human bodies by taking wives and producing hybrid offspring, and they have violated the boundary of knowledge by teaching secrets that weaponize creation against itself. In Genesis 6, this is compressed into a few verses about sons of God and daughters of men. In 1 Enoch, it is unfolded into a legal case. The message is stark. There are categories of rebellion that are not errors of ignorance or momentary lapses. They are structural betrayals of vocation. Angels who are appointed as guardians, watchers, mediators themselves have turned into predators and corruptors. For this, intercession fails. That failure is important. The book is not claiming that mercy does not exist. Throughout apocalyptic literature there are prayers for the righteous, promises of vindication, images of restoration. But here, mercy has a shape. It is not infinite permissiveness. It operates within, and not against, the grain of the cosmos Enoch has been shown. You can feel the tension. On the one hand, a human is exalted to act as scribe and messenger in the highest court. That is a mercy in itself, a sign that mortal, suffering communities are not voiceless. Their representative stands where rebellious angels feared to stand. On the other hand, that same representative is told to deliver a refusal. The decree is written. The judgment is not negotiable. The line has been crossed too far. For ancient readers, especially those living under empires where the powerful could act with impunity, this story did 2 things at once. It said, even the highest beings are accountable. No rank places you beyond judgment. If angels can fall under sentence, then kings and priests certainly can. And it said, there is a point at which injustice must stop being managed and must be ended. The book links divine justice directly to concrete harms. The giants do not just exist, they devour. The watchers do not just sin privately. They unleash technology and magic that enable oppression, sexual exploitation, and the shedding of innocent blood. Human cries ascend because humans are being crushed. In that sense, The heavenly courtroom echoes the grievances of real communities. Bloodshed pollutes the land. Exploitation distorts social life. Secret knowledge used for domination, whether in warfare, seduction, or economic manipulation, tears at the fabric of covenant. When judgment is pronounced on the watchers, it is not arbitrary. It is tied to these effects. They will be bound under the hills of the earth. Their giant sons will turn on each other and die by mutual destruction. The earth that has soaked up their violence will eventually be cleansed. The text is clear that this is not only about angelic discipline, it is about ending a system that thrives on blood. Here, divine justice and community ethics meet. A universe with prisons for stars and calendars for festivals is also a universe where murder has consequences, where the cries of the oppressed are heard, where those who teach others to sin bear responsibility for the damage they cause. The cosmic tour and the courtroom scenes are two angles on the same structure. Ritual impurity, economic exploitation, violent rule, these are not just social issues. In the imagination of one Enoch, they are violations of the architecture of reality. They push against walls that will not bend forever. For modern readers, especially those attentive to the historical and literary character of the text, it is important to distinguish levels here. On one level, one Enoch presents these hearings, petitions, and sentences as visions of real events in a primordial past and an approaching future. The narrative voice is confident. Angels speak. Decrees are issued. Valleys of punishment are prepared. On another level, scholars often read these scenes as theological drama, symbolic court cases articulating convictions about God's justice, human suffering, and the limits of divine patience. They give narrative form to questions. How long can evil go on? Is there any accountability for powers that seem untouchable? Does mercy mean endless delay of judgment, or can it also mean the firm ending of harm? The Book of Enoch does not resolve these questions into a neat system. It stages them. It allows a human intercessor to plead for cosmic rebels, and then shows that plea denied. It portrays a God who listens to human cries and responds decisively, yet who does not easily erase the consequences of angelic betrayal. It honors both compassion and boundary. In doing so, it offers its readers, ancient and modern, a kind of moral map. In this map, hierarchy does not equal immunity. Power, even celestial power, is answerable. Mercy is real, but not infinitely elastic. Some structures must be dismantled, not rehabbed, and the same God who measures the paths of the sun also measures the weight of blood on the ground. Whether one takes these visions as literal history, theological poetry, or something in between, their impact on later Jewish and Christian imagination is hard to overstate. They helped shape an expectation that justice is not an illusion, that hidden wrongs will be brought into light, and that there are, finally, limits placed on every watcher, every giant, every empire. From that courtroom, the story of Enoch moves back into history, into the communities that copied his book, argued over it, and used it to make sense of their own struggles under foreign rule. To understand why a book like one Enoch exists at all, you have to step into the world that cherished it. It's not the world of Genesis. It's not the world of David and Solomon either. It's a later world, crowded, unstable, and very aware of its own vulnerability. Historians call it the Second Temple period, because it stretches from the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple after the Babylonian exile, around the late 6th century BCE, to its destruction by the Romans in 70 CE. But that neat phrase hides a lot of turmoil. Picture a small people living in a small strip of land, passed like property from one empire to another. First the Babylonians, then the Persians, then Alexander's Greek Empire, then the Hellenistic kingdoms that fought over his leftovers, eventually Rome. Every new ruler brought fresh pressures, taxes, garrisons, cultural expectations, and sometimes outright attempts to rewrite what it meant to be part of Israel. This is the soil in which Enochic literature grows. On the surface you might see a rebuilt temple, priests offering sacrifices, pilgrims coming up to Jerusalem for festivals. You might hear Torah read in synagogues, children learning the stories of Abraham and Moses. But under that surface, identity is being renegotiated. What does it mean to be faithful when your land belongs in practice to someone else's king? When the anointed who rule over you are foreign generals or local elites who seem more loyal to the empire than to the covenant? Under the Persians, there is a kind of supervised freedom. Under the Greeks, a growing tension between traditional ways and Hellenistic culture. Gymnasiums, theatres, philosophical schools, new gods with old names. Under the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, things come to a breaking point. The temple is profaned. Traditional practices are outlawed. Some Jews adapt, others revolt. The Maccabean uprising, with its guerrilla warfare and its rededication of the temple, leaves deep marks on the collective imagination. Even after that revolt, independence doesn't last. The Hasmonean rulers who come to power combine priestly and royal roles in ways not everyone accepts. Factions emerge. Parties form, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes and others. Then Rome arrives, and with it a new layer of imperial oversight, new taxes, new humiliations. This is a world of constant negotiation and frequent disappointment. Promises in the scriptures speak of restoration, justice, a Davidic king, peace under God's rule. Lived reality is foreign troops, corrupt officials, and the sense that wickedness often prospers while the righteous are trampled. Under conditions like this, a certain kind of literature flourishes. We call it apocalyptic, but in its own time it wasn't a genre label so much as a way of seeing. It takes the language of revelation, visions, angels, journeys into heaven, and uses it to say, what you see on the surface is not the whole story. In apocalyptic writings, the veil is drawn back. Human empires are exposed as beasts. History is laid out in symbolic sequences. Hidden causes of present suffering are revealed. Demons at work, rebellious angels, cosmic forces twisting human rulers into instruments of oppression. This is not escapism. It's a form of protest. If you cannot change the king in Jerusalem or the governor in Caesarea, you can still insist that their power is temporary, that justice belongs to a higher court. You can imagine the universe as stacked against tyranny, even when your daily experience tells you that injustice wins. 1 Enoch belongs right in the center of this apocalyptic surge. Alongside Daniel, along with texts found at Qumran and writings like Jubilees, it participates in a shared conversation about 4 big themes: purity, covenant, angelic and demonic powers, and the end of the age. Purity first. For many Second Temple Jews, holiness has become not just a temple concern but a whole life project. Food, marriage, Sabbath, bodily states. These are ways of marking allegiance to God in a world that keeps trying to blur the lines. In Enoch, purity is pushed back even further into the deep past. The Watchers don't just lust or teach neutral skills, they contaminate. They bring in forms of knowledge and practice that stain human life. Sorcery, weaponized cosmetics, blood-soaked technologies. The world becomes ritually and morally polluted long before any Babylonian army ever marches. Covenant, second. The ancient promise between God and Israel is being contested. Who really keeps it? Is it the priestly establishment in Jerusalem? Is it separatist groups in the desert? Is it those who adapt to Greek culture while observing basic laws, or those who refuse any compromise? Enoch reframes covenant on a cosmic scale. Humans are not the only covenant breakers. Angels had assignments too. They were supposed to watch, guard, mediate. They betray that calling. Their fall becomes part of the explanation for why covenant faithfulness is so hard on the ground. The deck, the text suggests is stacked, not just by human traitors, but by cosmic ones. Then comes angelology and demonology. By the Second Temple period, Jewish thought is increasingly populated with named angels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and with more developed ideas of demonic forces. This is visible in Daniel, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and later in the New Testament. Enoch pushes this into elaborate detail. Angels have ranks, tasks, territories. Some watch stars, others preside over winds, seasons, human destinies. The watchers themselves are a particular order with a particular failure. Their offspring, the giants, become restless spirits after their deaths, roaming the earth, afflicting humans. In later Jewish and Christian thought, these restless spirits are one root of demon language, evil presences tied to an ancient catastrophe. Finally, eschatology, thinking about last things. Second Temple Jews do not all agree about how the story ends. Some expect a restored earthly kingdom. Some imagine a transformed cosmos. Some envision a righteous remnant preserved through catastrophe. The Book of Daniel offers one scheme. The Qumran community holds another. Later rabbinic and Christian writings will develop still more. Enoch adds its own layers. In its visions, history moves toward a decisive divine intervention. The watchers are bound, the giants are destroyed, the earth is renewed, the righteous dead are vindicated. Future generations will inherit a cleansed world where the old contamination has been burned away. What makes 1 Enoch so valuable is not that it speaks with one unified Second Temple voice. There was no such single voice. The period is full of debate about law, temple, calendar, politics, and the meaning of suffering. Enoch disagrees with other texts at key points. Its calendar scheme clashes with the one used in Jerusalem. Its portraits of angels and cosmic geography are much more expansive than anything in the Torah. Its retelling of Genesis reshapes the brief note about sons of God into a sprawling indictment of heavenly rebellion. Yet, it is also in conversation with its neighbours. Like Daniel, it uses visions to interpret empires. Like Jubilees, it rewrites early Genesis to make sense of present troubles. Like the Dead Sea Scrolls, it draws a sharp line between a polluted world order and a righteous community that must remain faithful under pressure. Read as a document of its time, 1 Enoch becomes a window, not just into speculation about angels and giants, but into a community's struggle to hold on to moral clarity when power seems permanently misaligned. Instead of saying, "This is just the way the world is," the book insists that the world is out of joint. Violence, exploitation, and secret knowledge used to dominate are not normal. They are symptoms of a deeper betrayal that reaches back into the structure of creation itself. By turning that conviction into visions of metal mountains, star prisons, heavenly courts, and bound angels, the Enochic writers gave their readers something crucial, a way to imagine resistance. Empires might claim to be eternal. The book says they are temporary. Priests might act as if they stand between God and the people. The book shows a scribe from before the flood walking into heaven with a complaint. Human rulers might seem untouchable. The book reminds you that even the watchers were arraigned and sentenced. In that sense, Enoch is a moral protest in narrative form. It refuses to accept that injustice is just the way things are. It anchors outrage in a cosmic story, and then dares to say that the present order, for all its apparent stability, is already under judgment. From here the question becomes, if this book spoke so powerfully to communities under pressure, why did it eventually vanish from most Jewish and Christian Bibles? To trace that disappearance, we have to watch Enoch leave the caves and shelves of Second Temple scribes and reappear in a very different place, inside jars of crumbling parchment on the shores of the Dead Sea. When the first Dead Sea Scrolls were unrolled in the late 1940s, most headlines focused on biblical manuscripts. Isaiah, the Psalms, fragments of Deuteronomy. It was like finding time capsules of the Hebrew Bible 1,000 years older than any copies we'd had before. But tucked among those scrolls were pieces of something stranger. Bits of a book that, in most modern Bibles, doesn't exist at all. Lines that mentioned Enoch by name, descriptions of watchers, of heavenly journeys, of calendars and judgments that sounded eerily like the Ethiopian version of 1 Enoch, but not always in exactly the same way. For the first time, we could say with real confidence, this wasn't just a late curiosity. Enochic writings were circulating in Jewish communities long before the time of Jesus. The caves at Qumran, near the Dead Sea, yielded fragments of multiple Enochic works. Scholars count at least 11 separate manuscripts that preserve pieces of what we now call 1 Enoch, all in Aramaic, the everyday language of many Jews in the Second Temple period. That detail alone tells you something. This wasn't an obscure priestly text locked up in the temple. It was written in the language of the street, the marketplace, the village. Whatever else we say about it, 1 Enoch was meant to be read, copied and heard by ordinary people. The dating of those fragments pushes Enochic material back into the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, maybe earlier. That places it right in the same era as Daniel, Jubilees, and other apocalyptic works. It also means that by the time of the Maccabean revolt and its aftermath, stories of watchers and their judgment were already part of the cultural conversation. But here we have to be careful. The Qumran Enoch fragments are just that. Fragments, torn edges, missing lines, whole columns lost. When you compare them to the full Ethiopian version of 1 Enoch, you find strong overlap but also gaps and differences. So the scrolls can tell us some important things, and they are silent about others. They confirm that substantial portions of what we now call the Book of the Watchers, the astronomical book, and related sections were already in circulation centuries before the Common Era. They confirm that Enoch was not a marginal curiosity in one language and one place, but part of a broader set of traditions in Aramaic-speaking Judaism. They also confirm a basic shape. Enoch as a visionary scribe, watchers descending, giants appearing, heavenly tablets, cosmic calendars, future judgment. What they cannot do is give us a neat, final, original edition. We don't get a complete scroll of 1 Enoch from Qumran that we can lay alongside the Ethiopian text and say, this is the same book. Instead, we get glimpses, overlapping passages that match closely, isolated verses that parallel material we only knew from translation, and tantalizing signs that Enochic literature was still developing. In other words, the Dead Sea Scrolls don't prove that the later Ethiopian collection is word for word what someone in the 2nd century BCE was reading. They show that the core traditions behind that collection were alive, evolving and influential in precisely the period when Jewish apocalyptic thought was taking shape. Equally revealing is where those fragments were found, and what they were found alongside. Qumran was home, most scholars think, to a sectarian community with sharp views about purity, temple practice, and the end of days. Whether we call them Essenes or use some other label, their library has a distinctive profile. They're obsessed with calendars. They argue for a strict 364-day year, with festivals falling on unchanging days of the week. They see the temple establishment in Jerusalem, which follows a different calendar, as compromised, maybe even illegitimate. This is exactly the kind of argument you find in parts of 1 Enoch. The astronomical book lays out a rigorous solar calendar. Days, months, and seasons are described as if the universe itself was a carefully tuned mechanism. The point is not abstract math. It's that time belongs to God, and if you get the calendar wrong, you're silently breaking covenant with every misdated festival. For a group like the Qumran community, who define themselves partly by their calendar, Enoch was not just interesting, it was ammunition. The same is true for purity. Qumran texts draw sharp boundaries between the sons of light and a world they see as polluted. The priesthood in Jerusalem, the broader population, foreign rule. They regulate meals, marriages, and communal life with intense detail. Enoch's story of the Watchers adds a mythic backstory to that concern. Impurity isn't just about individual choices. It is a legacy of a primeval invasion of forbidden knowledge and illicit unions. The world, Enoch says, was poisoned long before the present temple was ever built. For a community that felt itself surrounded by compromise, that worldview would resonate deeply. And then there is the end of the age. Qumran's own writings, like the War Scroll and the Community Rule, imagine an imminent final conflict. The sons of light versus the sons of darkness, angelic armies fighting alongside human ones, a purged creation where only the righteous remain. Enoch's visions of judgment, cosmic upheaval, and a renewed earth slot neatly into that expectation. The language is not identical, but the architecture of hope is similar. Present suffering is framed as the prelude to a decisive divine intervention. This deep alignment of interests, calendars, purity, end times, helps explain why Enochic writings are so well represented at Qumran compared to other Jewish libraries we know about. The community didn't invent Enochic tradition, but they curated and extended it. And they didn't stop with the sections we now fold into one Enoch. Among the scrolls is another work modern scholars call the Book of Giants. It survives in Aramaic at Qumran, and later in a different form in Manichaean texts. The Book of Giants belongs to the same imaginative world. It fills in the story of the Nephilim with new detail, named giant figures, dream visions of impending doom, attempts by these hybrid beings to understand or evade the judgment coming upon them. If 1 Enoch gives you the descent of the Watchers and the broad outline of the giants' fate, the Book of Giants zooms in on their inner lives, their terror, their confusion, their failed appeals. Together they form what many scholars now call an Enochic tradition, or Enochic stream. Not a single book, but a cluster of related compositions that expand and reinterpret the same core myth. And again, the presence of this material at Qumran tells us something and leaves other questions open. It tells us that among at least one influential sect, Enochic myths of angels and giants were not fringe. They were part of how the community thought about history, impurity, and the looming end. It does not tell us that all Jews everywhere saw it that way. The very fact that the Qumran group treasured Enoch and polemicized against temple authority suggests division, not consensus. Other Jewish groups of the same period, Pharisees, Sadducees, later rabbinic circles, leave far less trace of Enochic enthusiasm in their own writings. So the Dead Sea Scrolls witnessed a popularity without proving universality. They show that for at least one rigorous text-loving community on the shores of the Dead Sea, Enoch was a key part of the interpretive toolkit, a way of explaining why the world was crooked, why the temple was defiled, and how God would eventually set things right. But they also set up the next puzzle. If Enoch could be so central in a Second Temple library, if its myths could shape a community's identity and calendar, how did it end up on the outside of most later Jewish and Christian canons? To answer that, we have to leave the desert and follow the book into a new set of readers, early followers of Jesus, who quote it, allude to it, and then quietly let it slip away. When you turn from the caves of Qumran to the pages of the New Testament, Enoch doesn't disappear. He slips into the margins, but he's still there, leaving fingerprints. The clearest one is in a tiny letter almost at the end of the Christian Bible, the Epistle of Jude. Jude is short, urgent, and obsessed with a familiar problem: corrupt teachers, moral chaos, and the sense that hidden spiritual forces stand behind human behavior. To make his point, the author reaches for examples his readers would recognize: the Exodus generation, Sodom and Gomorrah, rebellious angels, and then he quotes something that in most modern Bibles you won't find anywhere else. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these people, Jude says, and then he introduces a saying that lines up closely with 1 Enoch 1:9, the Lord coming with myriads of holy ones to execute judgment and convict the ungodly of their deeds and hard words. This is not a vague echo, it's a direct citation, introduced with the kind of formula usually reserved for Scripture. For at least this one early Christian author, a line from an Enochic apocalypse was good enough to explain what God was about to do in his own time, but even here we have to be careful. Jude never tells us he's quoting a bound volume labelled the Book of Enoch, the way we think of it now. He cites a known Enochic prophecy. That could mean he knew a written text very much like 1 Enoch. It could also mean he was drawing on an oral tradition that circulated similar material. The wording is so close to Ethiopic 1 Enoch that most scholars think some written form lay behind it. Still, it's influence and citation, not an explicit statement of canon. Jude isn't alone. The first letter of Peter, and especially 2 Peter, move in a world that feels very Enochic. 2 Peter talks about angels who sinned, being cast into gloomy chains of darkness until judgment. The exact language differs, but the sequence, rebellious angels, Noah's flood, cities destroyed, is the same chain of examples you get in Enochic retellings of Genesis 6. The focus on corrupt teachers, greed, and sexual immorality as symptoms of deeper cosmic disorder is also familiar. The Book of Revelation, with its cascades of angels, sealed books, and visions of judgment, has often been read alongside 1 Enoch. There are clear thematic resonances, heavenly journeys, cosmic books recording human deeds, the final opening of those books in a courtroom-like scene. The image of rivers, mountains, and stars responding to divine verdicts feels at home in an Enochic universe. But resonance is not proof of direct borrowing. It may tell us that the same apocalyptic atmosphere that produced Enoch was also saturating early Christian imagination. Authors like John of Patmos and the writers of Jude and 2 Peter seem to breathe the same air as the Enochic scribes, even if we cannot always trace a clear line from one text to another. What we can say with some confidence is this. Early Christians found Enochic themes useful for thinking about evil powers and final judgment, where later Christian theology will often explain sin primarily in terms of Adam and the fall. Many Second Temple Jews used the Watcher's story to talk about why the world feels invaded, why violence, forbidden knowledge, and corrupted desire seem to have a non-human edge. Early Christians inherit both strands, and in some places the Enochic one comes through strongly. Jude's world is full of dreamers who defile the flesh, reject authority, and slander glorious ones. That language of celestial beings, blasphemy, and chains of darkness fits neatly with Enoch's account of angels who left their proper place, shared forbidden secrets, and were bound to await judgment. For communities of Jesus followers trying to explain why oppression continued, why empires still crushed the poor, why religious leaders could be corrupt, Enochic myth offered a framework. The world was not just morally off. It was wounded by a primeval rebellion that mixed heaven and earth in all the wrong ways. Judgment, then, was not only about individual souls. It was about God finally cleaning up a cosmic mess that began long before Rome. At the same time, Christian writers didn't treat Enoch uniformly, and they did not all treat it as scripture. In some regions, the book, or at least major portions of it, remained well known. Church fathers writing in Greek and Latin occasionally mention Enoch by name. Tertullian, a North African theologian in the late 2nd and early 3rd century, is a famous example. He clearly knows the Watcher's story from Enochic tradition, and at one point defends the book's authority, arguing that it was rejected by some Jews but ought to be respected by Christians, especially given Jude's citation. Yet even Tertullian admits that many in his own day do not accept Enoch as canonical. He is arguing against a trend, not describing a consensus. Other writers are more cautious, Origen, an influential scholar from Alexandria and later Caesarea, seems to know Enochic material and treats parts of it as edifying, but he does not list it among the books recognized in the churches he serves. Later figures like Augustine are much more skeptical. By his time, in the Latin West, Enoch is usually treated as non-canonical, sometimes as suspect. The situation in the East is more varied. Greek-speaking Christians around Palestine and Syria lived in closer proximity to the same Aramaic and Hebrew traditions that had nourished Enochic literature. Allusions to Enochic ideas, watchers, heavenly tablets, elaborate angelologies show up in some early Christian apocrypha and in writers like the author of the Epistle of Barnabas or the Shepherd of Hermas, both influential in some churches but never fully canonized. But influence does not necessarily equal endorsement as scripture. Many early Christian communities seem to have treated Enoch the way later readers treat respected theological books, full of insight, occasionally quoted, but not placed on the same level as the law, the prophets, and the emerging collection of apostolic writings. And that emerging collection is the key. As the first generations of Jesus' followers passed away, the question of which writings carried binding authority became sharper. Gospels attributed to apostles or their close companions, letters from Paul, accounts of apostolic acts. These texts were tied, directly or indirectly, to named eyewitnesses and founders. Enoch, by contrast, was anchored in a different kind of authority, the venerable patriarch taken up to heaven. That had worked in Second Temple Judaism, where ancient figures like Enoch, Moses, and Ezra could all be turned into scribal heroes in later works. But in Christian circles, gradually, the criterion shifted. Texts that could plausibly be traced to the apostles, or at least to the apostolic age, rose in status. Texts whose origins were more opaque, or which came through Jewish circles that Christians increasingly saw as other, began to lose ground. This did not happen overnight, and it did not happen everywhere at the same pace. Some local lists of Christian scriptures from the 2nd and 3rd centuries are flexible, including books that were later excluded and omitting some we now consider central. Enoch appears on very few of these lists, and when it does enter the conversation, it is usually on the edge, recommended for private reading, valued as a witness, or dismissed as unreliable. The result is a kind of strange respect. Enochic myths continue to shape how Christians talk about angels, demons, and the deep roots of evil. The imagery of bound spirits, of gloomy chains, of books opened in judgment, all of this flows easily into sermons, hymns, and later apocalyptic literature. Yet the book that carried those myths is rarely granted a seat at the main table. As bishops and councils begin to speak more clearly about Old and New Testaments, about books to be read in church and books to be left aside, the gravitational pull of apostolic authorship grows. Enoch's authority, rooted in an antediluvian figure and cherished in some Jewish and fringe Christian circles, does not quite fit. In the Greek and Latin mainstream, it slowly drifts outward, influential but unofficial. In a few Eastern traditions, and in Ethiopia especially, it will be treated very differently. There it will not just be quoted, it will be bound into the Bible itself and read as scripture. To understand how Enoch could fall out of favour in some Christian regions and at the same time become canon in others, we have to look more closely at how canon is actually made. Who decides, on what grounds, and why some beloved books end up on the wrong side of the line. When people talk about the canon, it can sound like a single meeting, a single vote, a single moment when someone slammed a list down on the table and said, "These are the books of the Bible, the rest are out." History is messier than that. Canon, in both Jewish and Christian traditions, is better understood as a long, uneven process in which communities gradually converge on a shared library of sacred texts. Different regions move at different speeds. Different leaders have different opinions. Some books are accepted early and everywhere. Others hover around the edges for centuries. If you could watch that process in time-lapse, it would look less like a committee and more like a shifting landscape of reading, copying, arguing, and worship. A few patterns do emerge. One has to do with language. In the world that produced Enoch, scripture for most Jews meant texts in Hebrew, sometimes in Aramaic. Later, as Greek became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean, many Jews read their scriptures in translation, in what we now call the Septuagint. Early Christians inherited that Greek Bible. A book's original language and its translation history mattered. A text that existed primarily in Aramaic, circulating in particular circles, had a different trajectory from one long embedded in the broader Hebrew or Greek collections. Enoch seems to have begun in Aramaic, with fragments of multiple Enochic books found at Qumran. Parts were clearly considered important there, but outside places like Qumran, it never achieved the same universal spread as, say, Isaiah or the Psalms. Another pattern involves authorship, or at least perceived authorship. Ancient Jews and Christians often attach writings to revered figures to give them weight. Moses, David, Solomon, Enoch, Ezra. Modern scholars call this pseudepigraphy, but for ancient communities the question was less about modern notions of forgery and more about fitting a text into a known sacred storyline. For Christians, over time, this became more focused. Texts linked to prophets and patriarchs remained foundational as part of what they called the Old Testament. But when it came to newer writings, a premium was placed on apostolic connections. Gospels associated with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Letters from Paul, Peter, James, John. Enoch in this environment occupies an odd space. It claims the authority of a primeval patriarch, the seventh from Adam. That made sense in a Second Temple Jewish world filled with visionary literature anchored in ancient heroes. But it did not fit as neatly into a Christian canon that was gradually organizing itself around the law and prophets on one side and apostles on the other. Then there is liturgical use. Books that were read aloud in synagogue or in church week after week naturally gained a kind of practical authority. They shaped prayers, songs, and the shared imagination of worship. Over time, people began to ask, which writings may we read publicly as scripture, and which should be reserved for private devotional study? If a text was rarely available or mostly confined to particular groups, it had fewer opportunities to become part of that common liturgical rhythm. Enoch seems to have had a strong presence in some Second Temple Jewish circles, like the Qumran community, and later in some Christian groups, but we have far less evidence of it being used broadly in regular public worship in the Greek and Latin churches. That absence matters. Theology also plays a role, though more in practice than as a neat checklist. Communities tended to favour books that could be harmonised with what they already believed about God, the world and themselves. This didn't mean every text had to sound the same. The Bible is full of internal conversations and tensions. But writings that seemed too far off the theological centre of gravity, or too easily misused, raised questions. The Enochic picture of angels, giants, and forbidden knowledge was powerful and compelling, but not always easy to integrate. Some Jewish teachers were wary of the way the Watcher's myth explained evil. If too much blame was placed on rebellious angels and their corrupting teachings, what happened to human responsibility and the central story of Adam, Eve, and the garden? Some Christian thinkers later had similar concerns. They might appreciate Enoch's emphasis on judgment and justice, while hesitating over its elaborate angelic hierarchies and speculative cosmology. Antiquity and continuity mattered too. Books that could be traced even loosely to a long-standing tradition, recited, copied, and commented on over generations, carried more weight than texts that seem to appear suddenly or only in isolated communities. Canon was not only about being old, it was about being old and widely recognized. This is where practical issues like transmission and availability quietly shape the outcome. Scrolls wear out. Manuscripts are lost in wars, fires, or simple neglect. A book that is copied often, translated into multiple languages, and held in many different regions is more likely to survive and to be treated as essential. A text preserved in a few monasteries or tight-knit sectarian groups lives a more fragile existence. The Enochic corpus, once vibrant in some Second Temple settings, did not maintain broad transmission in most Jewish communities after the 1st century. As Rabbinic Judaism consolidated around the Torah, prophets and writings, Enochic works largely fell outside the emerging norm. Christians for a time kept some of those traditions alive, but as their own boundaries hardened between what counted as Old Testament, what counted as apostolic testimony, and what was simply useful reading, Enoch often landed in that last category, if it was known at all. All of this helps explain a paradox. Enoch could be deeply valued, widely influential, and still not end up inside the final canonical lists of many churches and synagogues. It influenced how people imagined the fall of angels, the origin of demons, the architecture of heaven, the last judgment. It gave Jude a line to quote, shaped how some Christians read Genesis 6 and coloured sermons for centuries. Yet when leaders needed clear boundaries, books to be copied at all costs, to be read in every church, to define doctrine, Enoch hovered near the edge, not rejected everywhere, not embraced everywhere, not lost, but not central. Canonical boundaries are, in the end, community boundaries. They tell you which voices a tradition chooses to give its highest, binding authority. Those choices are driven by theology, yes, but also by language, geography, politics, and sheer happenstance. Enoch simply walked a path that, in most Jewish and Christian settings, ended slightly outside the fence, respectable in some quarters, suspect in others, fading in the West, surviving in translation in one remarkable corner of the Christian world. There, in the highlands of Ethiopia, with a different language, a different transmission history, and a different sense of what belonged in Scripture, the story took another turn. Enoch did not remain marginal. It became Bible. To understand how that happened, you have to shift your mental map. For most of this story, we've been looking at the Eastern Mediterranean, Judea, Galilee, Syria, Egypt, Asia Minor, Greece, Rome, Greek and Latin, rabbis and church fathers, councils and creeds. But early Christianity spread further and faster than that map suggests. It moved south along trade routes into the Red Sea, down the Nile, across the highlands of the Horn of Africa. There, in a kingdom called Aksum, Christianity took root early, and it grew in its own soil. By the 4th century, Aksum was a Christian empire. It minted coins with crosses, sent missionaries, corresponded with other churches. But it was never just a branch office of Rome or Constantinople. It had its own language, Ge'ez, its own liturgy, its own rhythms of fasting and feasting, and eventually its own way of drawing the lines of Scripture. This is where Enoch's story changes. Remember that Enoch's earliest versions were most likely composed in Aramaic. Those Aramaic pieces were copied by groups like the Qumran community. Some parts were translated into Greek. A few fragments made their way into Latin. But as the Western and Eastern churches gradually coalesced around their own Old Testament lists, Enoch slipped to the margins. Copies stopped being made. Scrolls wore out. In Ethiopia, by contrast, certain Jewish and Christian texts were entering a different stream. Sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era, probably between the 4th and 6th centuries, a cluster of Jewish writings preserved in Greek began to be translated into Ge'ez. Enoch was one of them. So were Jubilees and other works modern scholars call pseudepigrapha, writings attributed to ancient figures like Enoch or Ezra, but composed much later. The details of this translation movement are still debated. The translators don't sign their work. We reconstruct the process from the texts themselves, from hints and colophons, from patterns of vocabulary. But the broad outline is clear enough. Greek-speaking Christians, probably connected to Egyptian or Syrian churches, brought their books south along the trade routes. Ethiopian Christians, already developing a written Christian culture in Ge'ez, began to render those books into their own tongue. Not just the Gospels and Paul, not just the Law and Prophets, a wider library. Enoch, in this context, was not a fringe oddity. It was one of the books that came bundled with a certain version of the Christian Bible, a collection that, in some Greek circles, was still a bit more porous, still carrying traces of Second Temple Jewish literature that would later be trimmed away elsewhere. Once Enoch entered Ge'ez, its fortunes reversed. In the Greek and Latin worlds, the text gradually faded. Quotations stopped. References became second-hand memories. By the medieval period, many church leaders in Europe knew of Enoch only through Jude's brief citation and a handful of patristic comments. The actual book they were talking about had effectively disappeared from their libraries. In Ethiopia, the opposite happened. Enoch became one of the books that scribes copied, monks memorized, and churches read. It moved from being an imported curiosity to a local inheritance. Over centuries, as Ethiopian Christianity weathered invasions, dynastic changes, and internal reforms, Enoch remained part of that world's scriptural landscape. The form in which it survived there is what scholars today call one Enoch, or the Ethiopic Book of Enoch. It's the most complete version we have. 5 major sections, from the Book of the Watchers to the Epistle of Enoch. When modern Europeans rediscovered Enoch in the 18th century, they did it by acquiring Ge'ez manuscripts from Ethiopian monasteries and having them translated back into Latin and then into modern European languages. In other words, the text that had helped shape parts of early Judaism and Christianity, then largely vanished from the main Greco-Roman stream, came back into Western scholarship through a Christian tradition that had never considered it lost. Over time, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church did more than just preserve Enoch. It canonized it. Now, canon in Ethiopia, as elsewhere, is not a single moment or decree. It's a layered reality. Books used in liturgy, books used in teaching, books copied in official codices. But if you look at authoritative Ethiopian canon lists, and at the actual practice of which books are bound together and treated as scripture, one Enoch is there, not as an appendix, as part of the Old Testament. This doesn't mean that every village Christian in Ethiopia spends their evenings pondering the Watchers and the Nephilim. As with any tradition, some biblical books loom larger in everyday life than others. Psalms and Gospels tend to shape prayer more than obscure apocalyptic visions. But in terms of status, what may be read as the Word of God in church, what belongs to the official library, Enoch has a place. That produces an interesting contrast. In most Western churches, if you asked whether Enoch is part of the Bible, the answer would be no. In Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox lists, it belongs with other extra-canonical writings, important for understanding history and theology, but not itself scripture. In most Protestant traditions it is even further removed, read mainly by specialists and enthusiasts. In Ethiopian Orthodoxy, if you posed the same question, the answer would be yes, not because Ethiopia doesn't know what other Christians say, but because its own continuous practice, rooted in its own history of translation and worship, has drawn the boundary in a different place. This is a reminder that there is no single, universal Christian canon that has always existed in exactly the same form. There is a family resemblance of canons, with a large overlapping core, Genesis, Isaiah, the Gospels, Paul, and then a ring of books that move in and out at the edges depending on language, geography, and historical path. Some communities include Tobit, Sirach, and Wisdom of Solomon as scripture. Others place them in a secondary category. Some count the Maccabean books. Others treat them as historical supplements. Ethiopia includes works like Enoch and Jubilees that most other churches left outside. These differences can feel destabilizing if you imagine canon as a single, fixed list dropped from heaven. They make more sense if you see canon as that slow, uneven process we talked about. Communities reading, praying, arguing, and choosing which voices will define their shared story. The temptation, when facing competing canons, is to start ranking, to say, this one is right, the others are mistakes. From the inside of any tradition, people will of course have convictions about that. The Ethiopian Church believes its canon is the proper one. Roman Catholics believe theirs is. Protestants believe theirs reflects the true boundaries. From a historical vantage point, though, you can simply notice that different Christian communities, working with different languages and manuscript streams, made different decisions about a relatively small set of contested books. Those decisions are not random. They reflect the texts they happened to receive, the theological emphasis they favoured, the councils they held, the empires they belonged to or resisted. Ethiopia was never fully folded into the imperial church structures of Rome or Byzantium. It maintained its own line of bishops, its own liturgical language, its own scribal culture high in the mountains, often physically and politically removed from Mediterranean storms. That semi-independence made it, almost by accident, a repository for certain ancient works that vanished elsewhere. Enoch's survival there is part of that broader pattern. In the West, the book's vivid portrayal of watchers, giants, and forbidden knowledge made it influential, then suspicious, then expendable. It lingered in quotations, then fell into silence. In Ethiopia, it crossed a linguistic bridge, from Greek into Ge'ez, and found a home sturdy enough to carry it across more than a millennium. That doesn't prove that one canon is pure and another corrupt. It shows how fragile texts can be, and how much their destiny depends on very human factors. Which scrolls board which ships, which monasteries survive which invasions, which languages become liturgical standards, and which communities decide in the long run that certain writings sound like the voice of Scripture. Enoch, because of Ethiopia, is not just a ghost in footnotes. It is a living book in a living church, read as part of the same Scripture that tells of Noah, Abraham, and Christ. At the same time, in most other Christian traditions, it remains on the outside looking in, influential, intriguing, but not canonical. That tension brings us back to the central mystery of this whole story. A text can be foundational in one ancient Jewish community, quoted by a New Testament writer, revered as scripture in one branch of Christianity, and yet omitted from the Bibles most people in the world carry today. Its angels and giants can shape how generations imagined evil and rebellion, even as its name disappears from official lists. What does that kind of survival, partial and uneven, tell us about the humans who copied, canonized, and occasionally sidelined it? And what does the content of Enoch itself reveal about the way ancient people tried to make sense of sin, violence, and the unseen powers they believed moved behind history? To answer that, we have to look not just at where Enoch was shelved, but at what it actually says about evil, and why its explanation proved both captivating and controversial. When modern scholars read Enoch, many of them see less a handbook of secret angelology, and more a kind of mythic theology of evil. Not theology in the sense of neat doctrines and tidy definitions. Mythic theology in the sense of a story that tries to answer a question people always end up asking when the world feels unjust. How did things get this bad? In the Hebrew Bible, the answer is scattered. Some of the blame falls on humans, Adam and Eve, Cain, the builders of Babel. Some falls on mysterious figures like the serpent, or on unnamed sons of God in Genesis 6. But the text is sparing with details. It gestures at a deeper story and then moves on. Enoch, especially in the Book of the Watchers, leans into that gap. One line of interpretation calls this a mythic theodicy. Theodicy is the attempt to justify the ways of God in a world that looks full of failure. Why is there so much violence, so much corruption, when God is supposed to be just? Enoch's answer is not a philosophical essay. It's a narrative. In that narrative, evil is not simply a matter of humans occasionally making bad choices. It is a structural problem, the result of a cosmic breakdown. Heavenly beings, appointed as watchers, abandon their place. They descend, cross a boundary they were never meant to cross, and bind themselves to human women. Their offspring become giants who devastate the earth. Their teachings, warfare, weapon-making, sorcery, cosmetics, astrology, spread like a toxin through human society. The world drowns in blood, not just because humans are weak, but because powers that should have guarded creation have corrupted it from above. For many scholars, this is Enoch's most striking move. It relocates much of the blame for the state of the world away from ordinary humans and onto a rebellion in the spiritual realm. Sin is no longer just disobedience in a garden. It is a chain reaction that begins in heaven and cascades down through angels, giants, and finally to human culture. But that doesn't mean humans are innocent in Enoch. The book never says, "It's all the angels' fault, nothing to see here." Instead, it paints a more complicated picture of shared responsibility. This is where the theme of boundary violation becomes crucial. In Genesis 1, creation is all about boundaries, light and dark, sea and land, heaven and earth. Each domain has its place. Enoch takes that architecture of separation and turns it into a moral map. Angels have their own sphere, humans have theirs. When the Watchers decide to abandon their proper dwelling, as later writers will put it, they are not just breaking a rule, they are overturning the structure that keeps the world ordered. Scholars sometimes describe this as an anxiety about mixing categories, the pure with the impure, heaven with earth, human bodies with angelic power. The Watcher's sin is not simply lust, it is transgression in the most literal sense, stepping across a line that defines what kind of being you are. And once that line is crossed, it can't be cleanly uncrossed. The giants, the Nephilim, embody this confusion. They are hybrids, neither fully human nor fully angelic. They consume more than the earth can sustain. They turn to cannibalism and bloodshed. When they die, their disembodied spirits linger as malevolent forces, plaguing humans as what later traditions will call demons. From this angle, the flood in Enoch is not just punishment. It is an attempt at cosmic cleanup, a reset button pressed because the categories of creation have been fatally blurred. So if you zoom out, the Watcher's story becomes a meditation on responsibility at multiple levels. Angels are responsible for staying within their God-given limits. Humans are responsible for how they respond to forbidden knowledge. Leaders, whether supernatural or human, are responsible for the effects their choices have on those below them. When those responsibilities are neglected, the damage spreads far beyond the original crime. Another cluster of scholars reads Enoch as a coded critique of human violence and oppressive power. On this view, the giants, with their insatiable appetites and brutal domination, start to look suspiciously like ancient empires, massive, consuming, trampling weaker peoples underfoot. The forbidden arts taught by the Watchers, advanced weaponry, military strategy, manipulative charm, become symbols for technologies of control. Enoch, then, is not just about angels behaving badly. It is about a world where the tools of heaven, knowledge, power, authority, are misused to build systems of exploitation on earth. The myth becomes a mirror held up to the politics of the day. You can hear this social edge in the way the book talks about justice. The watchers beg for mercy. Enoch is sent to intercede. But the divine response is firm. Mercy has its limits when those in power have turned their gifts into instruments of oppression. Judgment is portrayed not as a divine mood swing, but as the necessary defense of a world being torn apart. That leads into another major theme scholars trace in Enoch, the shaping of demonology and spiritual conflict. Earlier biblical texts rarely lay out a detailed map of supernatural evil. There is a talking serpent. There is the Satan, an accuser in the heavenly court. There are spirits and strange beings at the margins of the text. But the idea of organized, ongoing conflict between God and a network of demonic forces is only dimly sketched. Enoch fills that outline in. By turning dead giants into restless, hostile spirits, the book offers an origin story for the kind of malign powers later writers will call demons. By portraying the Watchers as teaching humans destructive arts, it explains why evil feels both internal and external, something we choose, but also something that presses on us from beyond ourselves. Later Jewish and Christian demonology will not simply copy Enoch, but the influence is hard to miss. The New Testament's language about principalities and powers, its stories of exorcism, and its references to spirits in prison all resonate with patterns first systematized in Enoch. Cosmic rebellion, imprisoned angels, lingering malevolent forces that distort human life. At the same time, Enoch's universe is not a dualistic battlefield where God and evil are locked in an equal tug of war. The cosmic moral order, as Enoch presents it, is still grounded in a single sovereign God. The Watchers can rebel, but they do not dethrone. The giants can devastate, but only for a time. Justice may be delayed, but not indefinitely denied. This is part of what scholars mean when they talk about Enoch articulating a cosmic moral order. The book insists that the universe has a structure, and that structure is ultimately moral. Actions at every level, angelic, human, political, reverberate through that structure. Judgment is the process by which those vibrations are finally brought back into harmony. So where does that leave us? Reading Enoch now in a very different world. One reason modern readers are drawn to Enoch is obvious. The imagery is intense. Fallen angels, secret teachings, giant hybrids, heavenly journeys. It feels like a hidden chapter from a darker, more mysterious Bible. It invites speculation, theories, charts, and timelines. But you don't need to turn it into a coded history of ancient aliens or a suppressed conspiracy to feel its power. In fact, the more sober historical readings tend to find a different kind of fascination. At its core, Enoch is wrestling with questions that remain familiar. Why do those with power so often misuse it? Why does violence feel baked into the structures of society, not just into individual hearts? Why does knowledge that could heal sometimes end up wounding instead? The Watcher's story, read with historical care, becomes less a catalogue of sensational secrets and more an ancient attempt to describe how evil seeps from the top down and the bottom up at once, how systems go wrong, how boundaries meant to protect life become points of rupture. And then there are the open questions, the ones that scholars debate and that the text itself leaves partially unresolved. If angels can fall this far, what does that imply about the stability of the cosmic order? If so much damage can be traced to heavenly rebellion, how much responsibility still rests on human shoulders? If Enoch's explanation of evil was compelling enough to shape parts of early Judaism and Christianity, why did so many later communities decide they could live without this story in their official scriptures? Those questions carry us to the threshold of the last piece of this puzzle. Not just what Enoch says about evil and rebellion, but why a book that once framed those questions so vividly ended up outside most canons, even as its shadows lingered inside. So we end up with something that feels almost paradoxical. For a few centuries around the time of Jesus, Enoch was everywhere. It shaped how many Jews imagined angels, judgment, and the origins of evil. It shows up in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It echoes in early Christian sermons and letters. Its language slips quietly into the New Testament. And yet, when most Jewish and Christian communities finally drew hard lines around their scriptures, Enoch was on the outside. Part of that comes down to authorship. No serious ancient reader thought Enoch literally sat down with pen and ink before the flood. They understood the name as a way of framing the book, not a modern claim of historical authorship. But as debates about authority sharpened, that gap mattered more. A book that openly speaks from the voice of a pre-flood patriarch could be cherished as edifying, yet still feel too distant, too legendary, to sit alongside the Torah or the Gospels. Then there is the question of theological fit. Enoch turns Genesis 6's sons of God into a dense architecture of angelic rebellion, heavenly courts, and cosmic timelines. For many Second Temple writers that made sense. It offered a way to connect the scattered hints of the Hebrew Bible into a single sweeping story. But once Rabbinic Judaism and mainstream Christianity began consolidating their own theological maps, that same richness could look like a problem. Enoch's detailed angelic hierarchies, giant lineages, and apocalyptic schedules risked competing with emerging doctrinal frameworks. It raised as many questions as it answered. Transmission played its part too. Enoch circulated widely in Aramaic and Greek, but as communities shifted toward Hebrew on one side and Latin on the other, the text's footing became less secure. It never established a universal liturgical presence across all major centers. Instead, it traveled along particular routes, attached to particular groups. Where those communities lost influence, Enoch's status dimmed. Competing authorities added another layer. By the late 1st and early 2nd centuries, multiple books were offering grand visions of heaven, judgment, and cosmic order. Daniel, 4 Ezra, 2 Baruch, Revelation, and more. Communities did not need all of them to make sense of their world. They chose a few to carry the symbolic load. Enoch for many remained in the background as a respected ancestor rather than a governing voice, and yet even from outside the canon it still changes how Genesis 6 looks when you go back and read it. Without Enoch, the Sons of God episode is a brief, haunting fragment. Powerful beings, mysterious unions, giants on the earth, and then the flood, all in a few verses. With Enoch in mind, even if you treat it only as an ancient commentary, that fragment becomes a doorway into a whole landscape of Second Temple imagination. You begin to see how one tiny line in Genesis could generate a vast story about watchers, forbidden knowledge, and judgment delayed but not denied. You notice how later apocalyptic texts echo its patterns. Heavenly journeys, books of deeds, sealed fates, yet also intercession and mercy. You start to realize that when early Jews and Christians spoke about demons, imprisoned spirits, or a coming Son of Man, many of them were hearing Enoch, even if they never said his name. You do not have to believe Enoch is literally describing the architecture of the cosmos, or that its timelines correspond to our future, to let it do its work. As a window into how ancient communities wrestled with evil, injustice, and hope, it remains remarkably sharp. It shows a world where people looked at violence, empire, and corruption, and chose to tell a story in which those things are not normal, not inevitable. They are symptoms of a world out of joint, waiting to be set right. And that brings us back to the quiet question underneath the whole mystery. How do communities decide which stories belong in their sacred libraries? Canon formation is not just about excluding the strange. It is also about drawing a circle around a set of texts that a community believes it can live by, pray with, argue over, and hand to its children. Enoch sat close to that circle for a long time. In Ethiopia it stepped fully inside and stayed. Elsewhere it hovered at the edge, quoted, alluded to, debated, then slowly shelved. The fact that we're still talking about it suggests that those shelves have never been completely closed. If you've stayed with this journey, tracing angels and giants and lost books through history, you're already participating in the same long conversation about evil, justice, and what it means to imagine a moral universe. If you'd like to keep exploring mysteries like this, you can help more people find them by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications. I'd also love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and how you first heard about the Book of Enoch. Different places, different traditions often carry very different memories of this text. Wherever you are and whatever you make of Enoch's visions, the questions it raises about power, boundaries, and hope beyond judgment are still with us. The book may stand outside most official canons, but its shadow is woven into the stories that remain, inviting us to read them and our own world with just a little more attention.